to read from some works of Hartman that have to do with war and peace. As Cliff alluded or stated earlier in the introductory remarks, Hartman was greatly influenced by war during his lifetime. So it seemed to be always on his mind. And at some point he commented, and maybe it's one of the pieces that I will read somewhere, that we know how to do war a lot better than we know how to do peace. We're a lot better at war. And so part of his emphasis is how do we move us forward? How do we move forward in our lifetime so that we get good at having peace in the world? Understand that these were written at a certain time, and there is no gender neutral references in here. He uses man and mankind. He does not. So I'm apologize for that, but there's no gender bias intended. It is just the language of the time. So the first excerpt I'm going to read is from A Moral Science for the Atomic Age. I'm not sure exactly when this was written. I think it was written in the 60s and may have been influenced by the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we'll see what he has to say in this writing. It is commonplace to say today that we suffer from a moral and intellectual lopsidedness. The anguish and uncertainty of our age is due to the discrepancy in the development of the natural sciences on the one hand and ethics on the other. The natural sciences have developed methods which have brought gigantic natural powers within reach of any individual able to turn a switch or push a button. They have brought us the control of the cosmic power itself and enable us to blow up this planet or bring it unheard of abundance. The choice between these two alternatives, and the choice has to be made, depends on the development of ethics. Unfortunately, ethics or moral philosophy has not developed, as has its twin, natural philosophy. The natural philosophers of the Renaissance, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Leibniz, and others, who invented the tools of natural science, changed our world from an unconnected multitude of secluded villages and walled-in cities into a connected unit, interlaced by telephones and cables and railroad tracks and highways, air and sea lanes, sound and light waves. Natural philosophy has changed the face of the earth to a point that Julius Caesar and Columbus would not recognize it. Unfortunately, it is equally certain that Jesus Christ would recognize it only too well, for the inner landscape in which he was interested and where he hoped to establish the kingdom of God looks as barren and sterile and chaotic and anarchic, as neglected and uncultivated as in his day. While physical nature has yielded to man's inquiring mind and is opening up to him ever richer treasures, man's inner nature is a wasteland he has never bothered to explore with equal determination. Philosophers have recognized for some time that the only way to bring order into the present chaos of social sciences is to make the same kind of systemic analysis of moral phenomena and moral philosophy that's been made by the founders of natural sciences in the field of natural phenomena and natural philosophy. And from here he goes on to talk about axiology as being the science which can bring about changes to the world if it is put into application. Let's concentrate on one application to international relations which today harbor the possibility of atomic destruction. This possibility arises from the present chaotic thinking on values. Once we have learned axiology, this chaos will disappear. We shall then see clearly the reason for the peculiar fact that while every human being wants the good, yet as soon as he starts thinking in collective terms such as nation or state, he is to become an agent of evil. The reason is the transposition of the legal and the moral, of which we spoke earlier in this paper. States are not moral, but merely legal bodies. And we have seen that the immoral, the moment it is dressed in the language of legality, becomes acceptable to and even desired by otherwise moral persons. When we think of nations as powers, as we usually do, we are not interested in people as individuals, but as elements of still another system that sees nations as physical forces, in analogy to physical science as being in equilibrium, in a vacuum, and the like. Here we have a primitive transposition of frames of reference which axiology makes crystal clear. All foreign policy is based on the transposition of the intrinsic, the human, and the systemic, the legal. The intrinsic valuation of the intrinsic valuation of systemic value on the one hand, and the systemic valuation of intrinsic value on the other. The intrinsic valuation of systemic value is the axiological definition of fetishism. Systems may be thought, but they must not be loved, venerated, or worshipped. Otherwise, they become excessively valued and thus fetishes. Nations are mere abstractions whose realities are men and women, buildings and landscapes, all that we can see and feel with our senses. The unity of all this is a construction of our minds which thinks it together and gives it a name. This name then takes the place of the realities and is valued intrinsically. The expression for this valuation is the term sovereignty, which elevates the name of the nation beyond all realities and thus converts it into a fetish, which overlays the true humanity. This disvaluation of humanity is the systemic valuation of intrinsic value. We flatten out individual people who ought to be valued intrinsically in collectivistic, that is, systemic terms. As a result, people become labels, examples of isms or systems, communists, imperials, gringos, reds. And the destruction of labels, of course, is nothing immoral, but a legal duty which comes with some additional false valuation, easily becomes holy, a duty, a holy war for the fatherland, and so forth. Axiology teaches, and this happens to be the teaching of the Old as well as the New Testament, which both Christians and Jews forgot when they think in the collective terms of national sovereignty, that the one and supreme value is the individual human, and that to kill a single human being in the name of an idea, a so-called infinitely evil, not to speak of the mass slaughter of war. As Costello said when Calvin burned Servetus, burning a man is not the defense of faith, but the murder of a man. The Bible says words that are commonly misunderstood: overcome evil with good, not by additional evil. Axiology teaches us to understand these words. Sometimes he was more optimistic than others. This paper is entitled Our Existential Situation. Will We All Die Together? It's about a 1968 writing. This is about our interrelationship. It's not, therefore, a matter of indifference about how we live, for our true life is a contribution to the life of all. If we're not concerned about our own selves, we neglect not only ourselves, but we neglect in ourselves all others. If we do not love ourselves, says Jesus, we cannot love our neighbors either. And if, Kant says, we neglect humanity in ourselves, we neglect humanity in all. At the time of Jesus and Kant, these admonitions were just as true as they are today, but they were not a vital necessity in the sense that my neglect of myself could mean literally the death of all my fellow men, of my own family, my children, my children's children. I could neglect myself and waste my life and yet not immediately drag down the whole world with me. The welfare and misery of my fellow men was not immediately dependent upon my own spiritual well-being, except if I was a leader of peoples, a general or a politician whose moods and caprices could lead thousands and millions into misery and disaster. And even in those situations, the individual had always the possibility of avoiding the disaster. As Hegel has said, the juggernaut of history destroys only those who don't get out of the way. The human situation, in other words, up to now, has never been a limit situation. What was limited were the catastrophes, and even though there were often some sudden turns through natural historical powers, and even though often hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, had to die together, even though their individual death, the most private act for each of us, was a spectacle of collective powers, there have always been places on this globe where it was safe. Now this is all ended. All of us are in a limit situation in which we depend so much on the other that if we do not all see the existential dimension of our situation, we shall all die together. He is, of course, talking about the risk of nuclear war. This was at a time when the two nuclear powers were the United States and Russia. So those were the two that had to interface about this. And he talks about his reference for World War II is the Hitler War. And he talks about the huge amounts of explosive power that was consumed in World War II, and the massive damage that was done at that time, which he witnessed much of in the aftermath of when he visited Europe later. But then he makes comparisons with that to what at that time atomic bombs that were available were compared to the Hitler War. And so there's a point in the 60s where he says that the United States had the capacity to destroy Russia, as the USSR was called. I don't know about you folks, but when I was in school, Russia, the USSR, was just a big red blob on a world map. I did not know until the Soviet Union broke up anything. I had never heard of Azerbaijan and various other parts of the Soviet Union. It was all just one big red blob that we called Russia. And so there was a point at which the United States had the capacity to destroy Russia 3,500 times. And it was estimated that Russia had the capacity to destroy the United States 1,700 times. This mad logic of is the region of state. It's a logic of irrationality. That is, of rationalization. Those who are caught in it have their own jargon. Nuclear missile sites have survivability and vitality. That is, they are capable of surviving us. When we are all dead, our desolate land will be capable of spitting out bombs against Russia, and we would have the consolation of dying in the knowledge that all others would die too. The whole nuclear so-called politics rests on a fundamental contradiction. We trust that the enemy will be deterred by weapons for making war. But this can only be the case if he is rational. And if he is rational, we don't need the weapons. We can make treaties. If he is irrational, we may not be able to deter him, as Russia could not deter Kennedy in 1962, even though the Cuban missiles were no closer to us than the Turkish missiles were close to Russia. Nuclear power is too gigantic to be balanced. And in the end, the balance of power will fail as it has throughout history, most spectacularly in 1914 and 1939. If ever a madman came to power in a nuclear nation, such as Hitler, he would only have to push a button in order to have his boldest dreams of chaos surpassed by mad reality. The situation, far from being one of deterrence, is, on the contrary, an irresistible invitation for a madman. Thus we come to the question, what can we do? In the preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, we read the famous words, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the ramparts of peace must be erected." When the United States was founded, it relied on its distance from power politics in the Atlantic Ocean. Peace now is a matter of morality and not weaponry. Politics itself must be overcome. The sovereign national state is obsolete both in concept and in reality. He speaks a lot about the state being the government, the sovereignty. And his concept is that the state should be our insurance policy that takes care of the welfare of the people. And what he sees it evolving into is not an insurance policy, but a destructive influence which may destroy all of us in kind of an opposite effect. Then this is The Challenge of Peace, which was published in Vital Speeches of the Day in 1953, but was actually written for an Honors Day convocation at Ohio State University, May 17, 1949. What we need is a new spirit. Some of us don't know it yet, but this is a great time to be alive. It's the greatest time humanity has ever experienced. It took the whole of history so far to unify the world in body and mind. Now we must unify in spirit. To be exact, counting history from the beginnings of Egypt about 4,000 years before Christ, it took 5,500 years to unify the world in body. 500 years to unify the world in mind. If the ratio keeps on in the same proportion, it will take 45 years to unify the world in spirit and bring about peace. About one generation, yours and mine. By 1990, we should have peace. Anyone remember what was happening in 1990? The Gulf War. And at that point, the progress that had been made up to that sort of began to fall apart, because that was the first major conflict since Vietnam, and of course it's continued on through and has caused various kinds of political problems ever since, including doing away with some of the treaties that kept nuclear weapons in some kind of check. One of the things that he says is that Hitler was able to be so successful because he was so divisive. Divide and conquer was one of the things that happened. He says, what happened to Germans can happen in any nation. It's likely to happen if technological societies do not muster their moral energies. As it is, our moral and social life lacks intelligent organization. And he repeats a statement that, or this is the earlier statement, which I've already read, but natural sciences have developed methods which have brought gigantic natural powers within the reach of any individual able to turn a switch or push a button. Similarly, ethics will have to develop methods which will bring the moral powers of man within the reach of every individual. There will never be a moral push button, but there must be moral expertness. 100 years ago, we were ignorant about the nature of electricity. The research of men such as Faraday, Maxwell, and Hertz clarified the exact nature of that power. The genius of practical inventors, like Marconi and Edison, brought it within the reach of everyone. Today, we're ignorant of the natural power of morals. Theoretical research workers must define and analyze the power of man as it appears in the intricacies of human behavior. The genius of practical researchers must apply this knowledge to the management of individual and social affairs. We need a new method, that of integrating all sciences over the common denominator of humanity. Humanity is the giant who lives on the level of the atom and on that of the stars. The science of man cuts across all lines of scientific and even metaphysical division. Like the decimals of irrational numbers to fill the gap between the integers, so hyphenated sciences must be used to fill the gaps between the integers, so hyphenated sciences must be used to fill the gaps between the sciences, not only biophysics and biochemistry, but psychophysics, psychobiology, social psychology, medical economics, psychosomatic medicine, social ecology, mathematical geography, genetic ethics, bioethics, and so on and so forth. Between the good of tomorrow and the evil of today stands the ignorance of man about himself. If only a fraction of research funds used for the preparation of war would be used for research into the conditions of peace, the chances of man's survival would be immeasurably strengthened. What we need in this research are not so much instruments or techniques as thought. The old Platonic prescription still holds. The Platonic prescription was that leaders either need to be philosophers or philosophers need to be the leaders. The moral future is among us, but it cannot be reached through the patent office. It must start from within. Its aim must be the glory of man in all his creative power and cooperative achievement. And then this is the Revolution Against War, the paper. Cliff alluded to references that from Jan, his son, that he had intended to publish a book entitled The Revolution of War. I wanted to read from the very end of this. No new policy, no new politician is going to bring an end to what we object to. What we need is a new way of life. Thus, there is already more to the new moral humanity than the call for the development of a new science to create it. There is the commitment of an increasing part of humanity to this new vision. Once it is joined to intellectual understanding, The methods of peace will unfold as elaborately and efficiently as those of war. This will bring about a change deeper than any that has ever taken place in history. It will lead to the emancipation of the individual person from the state, the emancipation of the civil society from the military apparatus. Peace has nothing to do with capitalism, communism, or any other ism, any economic or ideological difference. The democratic, as the totalitarian citizen, dies for the same kind of fiction or sovereignty that did the medieval ancestors. The revolution against war is a rebellion of those who have stopped to salute Caesar. The subjects of the military system have suddenly become conscious of their fetters, and they want to live. So that was his vision. And included in this was the vision that there would be schools and institutes of axiology to teach this to everyone so that it would be common practice every day in everyone's thinking. Hartman had great confidence in logic and axiologic. You know, he thought that in those two things, you know, applied in the world, and with practical application like that, you know, maybe we can make some progress. Thank you.